quantum physics shows is that it basically is a set of partial differential equations that basically predict the probabilities of different observations as part of a wave pattern that's continuous, and everything's interlinked. Now, a lot of the times they'll talk about the observer phenomenon, where basically, depending on whatever experiment you're doing, it'll turn into one observation when it's observed. Okay? But what they've done back in 1970, they started to model what goes on in the brain. And it turns out the observer is really a participant in the overall pattern. And things are interlinked intimately, where a change at one location, especially when your mind is resonating or observing something, can slightly affect the odds of the way things happen outside. And basically, the amount of displacement you can get from, let's say, if there were experiments where they were bouncing cubes down a ramp, and the modeling shows you could change the angle of an individual bounce by about 10 to the minus 17th degrees maximum. But it's a chaotic system where every subsequent bounce doubles the angular displacement. And so the overall effect is up to about a sixth of gravity at maximum. It depends on the density of the cube and the angle of the bounce. This was all modeled. Now, first I'm going to talk a little bit about what waking consciousness is, what it's about. Well, what happens is the threshold between waking and sleeping consciousness is when you've got signals coming into and out of neurons at the same time. When you have a whole network of your neurons in the brain operating like that, it's like a feedback loop. And the position of an individual electron, if you try to model it, it's going to be spread out throughout the entire region of the brain that's operating above that threshold. And it turns out that threshold is the threshold in people and animals between waking and sleeping consciousness. And it's a fairly simple equation that I show on the back that describes it. This was published in Mathematical Biosciences in 1970. It's not controversial at all. In fact, some of the circuits now that are used in for artificial intelligence use that kind of principle. And the military's been using this sort of feedback circuitry to do things like recognize tanks or whatever from aerial photos, where if you're trying to do it linearly by normal computer programming, you would never really, it would just be too complex to try to figure out. But if you set up a resonance pattern, you know, you can get that result. Now, if your system's fast enough and you've got a quantum mechanical link going on, because what happens is you get tunneling between the neurons when a neuron fires, where the position of an electron normally would be confined to maybe within an atom or a very small region. But when a neuron fires, the wave that describes where an electron is fills up the gap between the neurons with about an equal probability through something called tunneling. And in any event, when you have the neurons firing above a certain frequency, it's the number of neurons to 2/3 power divided by the delay time between the signal coming in and out. It's of a given neuron is the basic formula that will tell you when you've got that kind of resonance.
I'm having a little trouble following. So you're saying when you're asleep, the neurons are firing above a certain resonance?
When you're asleep, they're below that frequency unless you're dreaming.
unless you're draining.
Yeah,
okay.
then the rate speeds up, and you'll get this rate where you've got basically a feedback loop, and you've got a resonance going on in the brain where what would describe where an electron is fills up the whole region of the brain, okay, which is firing above that frequency. And it turns out that when you have that, you have a unification between the information storage and retrieval and sensory and motor mechanisms going on in the brain. And when all that is unified into one thing, that's waking consciousness. And it's a very simple model. Now, what happens is that's been well established. And by 1975, Evan Harris Walker had modeled the process of observation, where where you're observing something. Let's say it's cubes bouncing down a runway, and you got photons coming in, and you model that with the brain as a resonator, and it makes predictions that have been proven and reproduced. And he ended up in charge of the Army Ballistics Research Center, Aberdeen Proving Grounds, their artificial intelligence programs. The military put it to uses that wasn't all that kind, like the way Gatling guns are mounted on helicopters is they're designed to bounce around randomly, because you can because the way you're thinking can bias the results in the direction of where you're thinking. It's been a long thing, and let's say it's in artillery. There's been lore about this sort of thing going back as far as there is artillery, and it's been proven now, and it's been reproduced. Another interesting result that from the theory is that when you model what's the chances of getting the right answer on a guess the card test, like Zener cards? Well, the model, instead of showing like a random, smooth, bell-shaped curve, you'll find bumps at different frequencies of getting the right answer. And the modeling, based on the number of neurons in the brain that are, resonating when you're conscious, predicts where those bumps would be in terms of enhanced probability of getting the right answer. And it turns out that when you process tens of thousands of Zener card tests, you'll find that the actual spectrum of the number of right hits, by number of population, the bumps of increased probability of getting the answer right are right where the modeling would show it to be. Except there's more, the magnitude of the bumps of enhanced results are higher than what the modeling would show, and that's because the modeling assumes just a general random distribution and then just the resonances, but there's learning going on. And so that you get enhanced probabilities of getting the right answer. And my experience with it is I got this information back in 1978 and went through it and summarized it and started doing workshops on it. And at the time, some of it was classified, but I figured, okay, motherfuckers, you want to take me to court for revealing classified information? Lots of luck, And later on, I ended up actually doing work for Aberdeen. I ended up moving from astrophysics to environmental engineering when I went for a PhD, because basically I decided that with what I do, I could do some practical good, even though I ended up in astrophysics. And I figured even if I proved some great theory, the air wasn't fit to breathe, so I switched fields. But I ended up doing work for Aberdeen, the Army Ballistics Research Center, and the Toxic and Hazardous Materials Agency, and ended up making contact with some of the people involved in the program. It was a revelation to me later on to find out that one of my physics professors headed this whole NSA program. And it turns out, like the head of the Mensa Parapsychology Special Interest Group, Stanley Korn, headed the Pentagon Meditation Society. We had direct contact with Walker. I never made direct contact with him because he headed this program and had to stay kind of among people with the security clearance he had. Didn't hang out very much. After he retired, he published a book. And when one of the things I did was back in '84, I lived in New York City, and there was a workshop at the Open Center on quantum physics and parapsychology. And it was being put on by Gary Zukav, who wrote one of the early books, The Dancing Woolly Masters, on quantum physics and consciousness and that. And basically, it cost me like $600 to go. It was just a weekend program, but I was making good money. I decided to go. Turned out I was the only person that actually spent their own money to go in. Everybody else was with SRI. And after the first few hours, they're talking shop. And basically, at the time, if I passed the test, I could get $45,000 a year, you know, doing work with the basically the CIA, you know, dowsing for submarines and stuff like that. But I was making 50 grand in the field I was in, and you know.
Let them through. Come here, Camille.
Things that were worrisome to the people involved in the program were, okay, dowsing for submarines or doing remote viewing for trying to figure out where somebody is or something. That wasn't a problem. Every so often you get some project manager who would want to send someone out to kill somebody or something. And the people, at least at the program, knew that was pretty much suicidal, because you're basically going to, when you try to resonate something, you're left with the original edition. And but what really was worrying to them also was the machines that were being developed, because there's machines, you know, circuitry that operates at a quantum level. You know, the quantum mechanical computers are starting to be declassified now and starting to become available. And right now, one of the applications that's getting to be common is the idea of a particle is it's not as localized as you might, as like Newtonian physics would have you think. That actually there's links between everything. If you create a pair of particles from the same thing, there's a very intimate link, and a slight change in one can cause a change in the other, no matter how far away they are in distance and time. And they're using quantum mechanical links of that nature for security right now on communications lines, especially in banks. In fact, that was on Nova on TV. They showed it recently. Because if there's any interfering observations going on, it'll scramble the signal. Now that's also why in magic there's a lot of secrecy on the magic, because you don't want to have interfering signals that would mess up your signal-to-noise ratio when you're doing something. Now, in a magical ritual, I'll talk about Wicca just as an example, because that's more commonly known than a lot of things I can talk about. The basic mechanisms is similar in Vajrayana Buddhism or other, other forms of magic. basically, one of the first steps is to clear your mind of interfering thoughts. So you're not just thinking about other matters and that, or you know, and you kind of get your brain cleared down to where there's no interfering signals, and you can get a clean resonance going.
And you sort of get focused.
Right, focused, right. Centered. And then there's a matter of getting a non-local state of consciousness. And that can be a matter of like grounding and centering, where you think of yourself unified with the earth and the sky, and the energy flows there. And then there's the calling on the elements. Well, the elements are basically consciousness resonance matrices. Air typically would have something to do with intelligence and movement, connections, that sort of thing. And fire, be power, and that. You resonate your mind that way, so you're not just resonating within your head. And then typically you call on gods or goddesses, whatever. And it turns out that consciousness isn't just normal waking human consciousness, and it's not something that's just localized in your own head. You know, all nature is full of consciousness. Like you go out in the natural area, there's often a group mind kind of consciousness going on, because the critters aren't exactly thinking about, you know, money and stuff like that. They're
have
kind
less
of connected
distractions
with each other and all that. So anyway, one can connect with gods or goddesses, whatever, nature spirits, whatever, that's common. And, you know, if they're interested in doing the same thing, then you focus on a target, visualize what outcome you're after, and then you activate a signal. You send you get your mind resonating, and you're connected to the target, and get it resonating with your signal, and then you basically release what they call energy, but it's actually subtler than electromagnetism. It has to do with the basic underlying wave pattern out of which matter and energy are manifestations of it. So that result is...
Can I ask this?
Yeah.
The better you focus, you're able to focus, the better you would be at this?
Yeah.
Okay.
And in fact, there's a quantitative relationship I show on the back here to that has to do with the amount of time you're in resonance with the target and the probability of getting the result. A lot of things are chaotic in the world, where a very slight change, like I was saying, like bouncing a cube 10 to the minus 17th degrees, you couldn't possibly measure 10 to the minus 17th degree angular displacement. But like many other phenomena in nature, it's something where it's a chaotic process where a slight displacement amplifies. Because every subsequent bounce you double the angular displacement, so you can get basically out of all the chaos that goes on around you, you can have synchronicities where things fall together.
So I have to ask questions because I'm not totally following.
Great.
But with these cubes, is the idea that the displacement is caused by the human mind? Is that,
yeah, they would get a group of people that would will, that are pretty good psychics to begin with, and they've tried it with different groups, it's been reproduced, and they'd bounce these cubes down a runway, and they'd ask people to will it to the right or will it to the left, and they'd see how much change there was. After, you get a couple hundred bounces, and you take 10 minus 17 degrees and increase that by 100% interest 100 times. Now you're talking displacements that can be measured.
It's not just humans. There was a study a few years ago about basically they would take a robot chicken and put a chick in the cage, and ideally the chick wants the mother near, and they would notice, and the robot would have a random element of which way it was going to go. And the chick was able to get it more often to go toward it than not.
That's interesting.
Right.
So it's not, it's not
And it was just a mechanical test.
just mechanical chicken, right?
Right. There was but one machine that was made used humans where you'd have basically a small radioactive source, and whether or not it went off in a given time period would make lights go the right versus the left. And they found that people could make the progression of lights spin to the right and spin to the left when controlled that way. And a lot of this information was secret for quite a while. And then when I knew about this in advance, about the plan, because the people that were doing remote viewing would run into the Russians that were doing the same thing. There's these books like Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain that were coming out back in the 60s and 70s as if the Russians got all over us. This country was founded by fucking Masons. And they had nothing over us as far as, the psychic stuff. But it generally stayed kind of hush-hush within the agencies. A lot of fundamentalists in that who didn't like the idea. And anyway, what happened was when the Soviet Union fell, the Russians published their stuff. And then the U.S. published its stuff, especially when some fundamentalists in Congress started making issues about the whole remote viewing program the CIA was doing, and all that psychic stuff, because it wasn't in the Bible, it was just their interpretations of the Bible.
Not in their interpretations.
Their interpretations.
Anything
and
could
so
pretty much be in the Bible.
classified it. Now, it used to be a very esoteric field. But now it's evolved into information theory and practical applications in terms of security and communication. Or they've recently managed to actually make quantum mechanical computers that can outdo any kind of computers that we by conventional methods by hundreds of thousands of times, because the interactions are essentially instantaneous. I can tell you one interesting experience. Byron here is a member of my group in DC. He was here, he saw this. When I left the DC area, because I'd made contact with some of the people in the program and that. I had what's called a mad scientist party. And Stanley was there, and Benson and some other people. And one person brought a machine. And there was maybe 50 people at the party. And there was maybe a dozen of us down the den where the guy was going to demonstrate this machine. And first thing he did was he put a little black box, put a card into it, and you could feel a vibe. It was like a pretty heavy sort of vibe, like if you ever go into a Shiva Ratri or certain rituals, you might run into a vibe. And you put another card in, it was a light sort of vibe. We could turn our back and you could tell, everybody could tell which card he had in, okay?
Also, you could put like a ring or something on top of it.
Yeah.
It would also resonate the same, whatever the vibe is of the ring or whatever you put, crystal.
Right. Then what happened was the party was pretty mellow. He did something to liven things up, okay? And so what happened was when we come back in an hour, within 10 minutes that place was rocking. And then about 11 o'clock, we got back together here to mellow things out. And put something in and mellowed out in the area. It had a range of maybe 100 feet or so. He also had a little dangly thing that you could put on that would put you in a psychic void, basically, and scramble it, essentially. Around midnight, he put in a card to raise sexual energy. Within a half an hour, most people were gone. Now, coordinated Earth Religions Legal Assistance Network. And there was a case in the late 90s in Baltimore where Baltimore had a law against divination, especially if there's any money exchanged. Okay? And there was a psychic fair that was going on there that went into Baltimore, and the city decided to prosecute the organizer. Well, for people to be qualified to participate in the psychic fair, they had to undergo a test. It turned out it was the same screening test that the SRI was using. Like, I was part of the program, and it was how the CIA was recruiting people to find people that could actually pass these tests. When the city went after him, he had his bosses talk to the city, and that put a stop to the harassment right then and there, because it was basically part of the NSA program, and some CIA, funded, a program associated with the government. Now, the program went into the dark budget, but now it's being run under Homeland Security.
So a dark budget was like a hidden
Congress
budget.
doesn't, they'll put up, here's the $3 billion, do whatever you want with it,
Okay.
They don't have to put it on the budget.
So all this goes on.
But it's going on, under Homeland Security now.
That's interesting.
The physics of it, the mathematics has gotten rather sophisticated. I've made contact with Russell Targ, my physics professor who headed the program. I got into it back in '68. When I got into physics in '65, but in '68 I met Russell Targ, who's one of my physics professors, and he was doing psychic experiments, and I was an observer, basically recording the results, and they were basically doing remote vision experiments and getting good results. I remember picking up on some of the stuff where I was just observing and recording, but they had certain people that would be saying what they were seeing. So, but back at the time, basically within the mainstream physics communities, any kind of question of what's behind the system, what's behind quantum physics, was considered to be verboten. It was a don't ask, don't tell, shut up and calculate approach to physics, But I had a friend from India in the physics program, and he turned me on to Swami Vivekananda, his writings. And it turned out in the Orient, in India, the connections between consciousness and outside phenomena and quantum physics was mainstream. And it's only become accepted in the mainstream now in the last maybe 20 years.
Here.
Yeah, I mean, you'll find stuff in physical review letters and foundations of physics and that to get into the consciousness issue, because when you observe something, they used to like to say, oh, it's a big mystery. You have the observer, when the observer makes an observation, then the wave function collapses, whatever. But if you actually model what's going on, your process of observation, you're a participator. It's not like it's not like when you're observing something, you're not affecting it. Now, normally at the large scale, just rolling a bowling ball or playing pool or something, driving a car, the phenomenon are so small that you really don't see, those effects. You'll see it.
Yeah, because I stink at golf.
Yeah.
I don't seem to be controlling it.
Right. It has to be a random phenomenon that amplifies, where you'll get things coming together. And the more chaotic, the bigger the amplification, the bigger the result you'll get. Basically, the field has gotten interesting in the last 20 years or so, because they've noticed, one thing that's interesting in quantum physics is, when you look at the math, anything that moves forward in time, you can also think of it moving backwards in time. And it turns out that when they do experiments like, they've got somebody supposed to push a button if the random number generator is going to blink in a certain time period. And if it isn't going to blink in the time period, don't push the button. What they found is they found a consistent time ahead of when the like it's done by the piece of radioactive material, for God's sake, you know, in a simulator that triggers it. That the people be pushing the button a few milliseconds before the thing actually triggered and doing it in the right direction.
Yeah, I think I've read about some of this stuff somewhere.
And you know, so that there's a resonance going on in time. That has a lot to do with basically being able to predict the future and stuff like that. But it also creates a resonance in terms of the brain's experience. That there's a bit more presence to it than would otherwise be the case. When the invasion of Afghanistan took place, one of the things that showed up on Nova was they had a drone that broadcast fear vibes in front of the troops. So the stuff's been put to use in not so good ways. A lot of the technology, they want to keep the details secret, but it's just a matter of time before the circuitry gets out now that the physics is well known.
Can you
explain? You just think what Walmart could do, or some store with a vibe generator, right around whatever its most expensive items or whatever,
I didn't follow that. They did what in front of the troops, and how did that affect things? What did they do in front of the troops?
They sent a drone that broadcast fear vibes.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's interesting. Wow.
And what was concerning the people back in that workshop was the machines that run the development.
The fact that they have that.
The fact that they have that.
Yeah, because they could use that anywhere and nobody would know.
Right.
Absolutely.
They ended up bringing one to my place before I left DC. Just as a demo.
Right.
And, it worked.
Well, there was all that talk about that they ran. Or they took, on the invasion, that the other troops ran away or something like that. There was, I don't know how true that is, but I heard that. Yeah, that's interesting.
Then again, like the United States gave the Islamic State billions of dollars of equipment by giving it to the Iranian army when the Iraqi army, and when the Islamic State came, they dropped all their equipment, their M60 tanks and everything, and ran. And that's why the Islamic State has essentially state-of-the-art artillery, tanks, missiles, the whole 9 yards.
They acquired it that way.
They acquired it because the Iraqi military dropped all their equipment and ran when they came.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. Now, when you use the word resonance, do you mean like vibration?
Yeah, like vibrations. It's like a feedback loop.
I don't understand what you mean by feedback.
Well, you ever see what happens if you put your microphone in front of your speakers with a stereo system? Maybe you've seen it at concerts and that where, you know,
you get louder.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of signal goes on in the brain when you've got a resonance. And when you've got that where the signals are feeding back and amplifies it, the way they do it in circuitry, because it turns out I'm part of a Tibetan Buddhist group here in Cleveland, and one of their teachers headed the FAA's internet security, just recently retired. And they've got all this technology for security on the, you know. It was interesting working with somebody that really knows the latest stuff, you know, currently. But they've basically, the way the circuitry will work is you can set it up where you'll have essentially a holographic image resonating in a chip of what it is you're looking for, and you'll have electrodes coming out, and when something comes into the chip that looks like what it is you're looking for, be it a tank or an airplane or whatever, and you know, when you've got a big image like like they get off satellites, you know, it'll increase the voltage off the electrodes, and that'll drive, because of the feedback, and that'll drive a monitor. And that's how they're able to use like satellite imagery and count tanks, you know, and you know, as they fly over, you know, in various parts of the world, and do other sorts of things. That's also how some of the circuitry and some of the smarter software works that uses remote, you know, depends on the internet signals. There'll be resonant circuits that can recognize, you know, things. So it's coming now into practical applications, but it has, you know, it's not all, it's not always used for the best purpose.
I was reading an author who talks about mentally creating almost like this vehicle, a Merkaba or something like that. Ever heard of that?
Well, there's,
and you can travel to other dimensions of it. And then he talked about, he also made references to the government and how, you know, he works with the government. I wish I was better. I think he had a name like Melchizedek, like, or something, you know, from the Bible. And he's written a bunch of books, and some of his stuff sounds so sci-fi. It's like real sci-fi sounding. But it's supposed to be, you know, he's presenting it as if it's legitimate. And after what I'm hearing from you, I'm starting to think, yeah, it could be. You ever heard of what I'm talking about?
Yeah, that's been part of shamanic practice for, you know, centuries.
Okay.
You know, where they'll have like a shamanic canoe or something, and a bunch of people travel together. Now,
in shamanism, there's a lot of use of imagination.
Yeah.
Right?
Let's describe some stuff that went on Vision Weeks. Okay. Okay. There's had a coven going in the D.C. area for about 10 years. They continued after I left for a while. Basically, one technique that we would do is we would cast the circle, and you know, like I described, and we maybe do it in a given tradition, be it Egyptian or whatever. And then what you do is everybody would be centered, and you have the group maybe intone and ohm together, you know, and whoever saw anything in their vision, in their mind,
So, you know, one time, I mean, it was just completely random, right? And we're all kind of picturing ourselves underground or somewhere where the sky is completely dark. And there's all these pillars poking up out of water. And there's like this alligator beam which suddenly shows up out of nowhere, you know, in our visions, you know? And so, you know, I tried to ask it its name, and so I'm getting this name like Ojebaba. It just kind of like echoes out. But or another time, we were also doing other things similar, and we were both me and you saw basically a car that did not have wheels. It was sort of like it was kind of bushing or something. Yeah. I remember something along those lines.
Well, the way this technique works is you would start out with everybody would intone their name once, and the group would intone the name back. Starhawk's written this up as a way to attune in a circle in the group, okay?
Who wrote? Somebody wrote about it?
You intone your name, and everybody in the group would intone the name back. Then, the next round through the group, people would intone their name and you visualize the person and intone the name back. Third time, the person would intone their name and you say whatever you see in your inner vision.
Okay.
Okay? And then you do like the Om together, and then if somebody saw something, you'd say what you see. And what would typically happen in a group that works well together would be, you know, you start to see maybe a cave, and before you get a chance to say it, someone else already says it.
Right. So
and then you go to the, you know, and you know, before long you'd be in a mutually shared vision area where things would come in, and before you'd had a chance to say it, other people would see it. And we would actually get, like, remember the time that we had basically visitation, essentially? Yeah. Right. What happened was half the people in the group knew nothing about Egyptian. And we had a visitation, essentially, by an Egyptian god form. And later on, when we came out of it, we pulled out books on mythology, and people that knew nothing about it would pick out exactly who it was.
Also, Green Tara was another one.
Yeah. Right. And so stuff like that happens.
It's interesting that you bring this up. I've only recently started seeing things, and I don't have any control over. I don't know what's going on, but I see stuff. Sometimes I'll even see like a video, but I'm a teacher, and sometimes things will bounce off my students. Like one year, my students named themselves the Spirals. And then I started seeing all these spirals, and they made spirals and put them all over the room. And I asked the one girl who suggested it, and I said, where did you get that idea about the spirals? She goes, I don't know, I kind of went to sleep for a second, and it came to my mind, and I was like, what? And then recently you're mentioning this Roman mythology thing. One of my students came to me and said, I want to study, I think we should study this Roman mythology. I've been reading Roman mythology, and I have recently become interested in that. Now she's asking me to study it, and I'm like, wow, Macy, that's exactly what I want to do, And
which is time. Because you're creating sort of resonance, and then it gets picked up in another mind.
So she's extremely gifted. She's very bright, and she's probably very sensitive, and so she may have. And all of a sudden, she usually reads different types of books. And I looked at her; she's sitting there reading that, and I was like, "Look what she's reading," And then she'd have this conversation with me. So it's really funny working with children because I think they're more sensitive, and because we got this kind of thing going back and forth.
Yeah.
And that's been very interesting. But what more can I do to get, like I get these flashes where I almost can't see them. I see blue sky with clouds. I see like a cave, like it's golden. I see something, I don't know what it is, might be fire. But I see these, and then like sometimes I'll see a video of, and it's usually crowds of people. And but I don't know what any of it means, or...
What I would suggest is trying to stay with the vision and then explore the area.
Look around.
Look around. See what else is going on. I mean, sometimes you just find yourself, in a place or a space or something like that. One of the useless things I used to be able to do is know what episode of Gilligan's Island was coming on.
That's funny.
You know, I mean, I would just be thinking about Gilligan's Island, and I'd start flipping channels, and that episode of Gilligan's Island.
Right. I have I mean, sometimes I think I'm crazy because I swear the TV, something I'm watching on the TV will give me a message almost that I've been looking for. Sometimes that happens.
There was a whole Greek thing. I don't remember the name of it, but it was basically asking a question to the crowd and then just walking through a crowd and listening to what the crowd says.
Right. Oh, that's
and then
interesting.
Boom, you'll hear it clearly out of the blue. You know, a friend of mine, she was worried about something, and I was telling her about this whole thing, and the restaurant closed, and we were being forced out the back door, you know, and the cook suddenly looks up and goes, "Don't worry about it, Julia, there's nothing wrong whatsoever." Out of the blue with he didn't hear us cook talking or anything else like that. He just answered the question.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, basically, you know, you start resonating yourself what the question is to the universe.
Right.
And the universe is going to answer however.
So that's what you do. I don't really know much about controlling. Like I started meditating and doing yoga, and then all of this stuff started happening very quickly. And I started seeing this perfect black circle with like a whitish background. I mean, perfectly black. And I would see it almost every time that I meditated. And one night I thought, oh, maybe this is a portal, and I agreed, well, what did I have the guts to go through the portal? And I said yes, but there was no dramatic moment, but I thought I saw sort of a spiral and a shaft of light, and I went to sleep. The next day I went on a field trip, and on the stage was a spiral and a shaft of light, and I'll tell you, it floored me. I was like, my sense of reality sort of did a little bleak at that moment, because it was like, oh, wait a minute, this isn't just seeing something, this is my real life, and there it is. You know, it was kind of really freaked me out.
Right. Well, the guy that my physics professor back in '67 ended up heading the NSA program, he's retired now, and since the details of the technique are well published, he started publishing books on remote viewing. This is just one of them that I happened to get.
So you actually did this remote viewing for the government?
Well, I never took a position with them, but back in '67 and '68, I was involved in the counterculture and everything, and I was one of the few people in physics class that could see what was behind this wave pattern. It wasn't a meaningless thing. And he picked up on it, and he had me be an observer on some experiments. We need people to record what people were seeing. I remember one particularly, there was a lady from Bali who was part of a fire walking group, and we had another person in Bali that would show somebody that was part of this group an image, a randomly selected image, and they'd see if the person over at Purdue and Lafayette could pick up on the same image. And so my job was to record what was being said by the person in trance. This lady went into the trance, had her hand in a candle flame for about 5 minutes without moving it. And would say, I see a square box, and I see a tree or whatever. And I'd be recording it. And there were a few times when I was picking up on it before she said it. And then the next day what happened was she'd come out of the trance, her hand would be black with soot, wash it off, no burn. That was pretty amazing right there.
Yeah, that's very amazing.
And then the next day he'd call the researcher and get what was actually being transmitted to the person, and the answers were right about 95% of the time.
Does somebody have a pen so I could copy the title?
Yeah, we can just look. Yeah. look up Russell Targ. There's some books on. This is just a survey book. There's some basic stuff on remote viewing that get in, but basically you clear your mind of interfering signals, like your purification, and then
is that like going into a meditative state?
You know, if you resonate, connect to the target, and then you can get what comes to mind may very well be connected with the target. Some people are better than others at it, you know. I had an interesting experience at the Earth Warrior Festival a couple of years ago. I decided I needed to do something about anger and stuff like that. I practiced Wicca and shamanism for many decades. And I decided to pursue Tibetan Buddhism because, first place, there's a Tibetan Buddhist temple right near where I live.
Where's that?
On West 14th Street, Jewel Heart. And it's not an authoritarian, hierarchical, you know, ridiculous cult sort of thing. Among the Lama that started this one had among his more well-known people right now Philip Glass and Patti Smith and Allen Ginsberg, you know, decades ago, and Tim Leary and that, you know. So anyway, part of the idea is to try to get to a state of mind called emptiness, where you're just at one with everything. And in any event, at the Earth Warrior Festival, they had a workshop on clearing your astral temple. And the way it worked was I've done shamanic stuff, Byron and others, you know, we had a place where you go that was a kind of an astral spot you find by projecting and group work and that. And then you call your spirit helpers, you know, from the different elements to clear the elements out. Well, my experience to clean it up is, what happened with me was they cleared everything. And it took me to a state that was a profound state. The closest thing I can, analogy would be those, maybe if you do about 800 mics of LSD, there'd be a certain point when you're peaking, maybe, you know, where you get to that kind of state. Only this was even clearer. Because they cleared everything. Other people had different experiences, but it turned out that experience was, that's what happened in my case. Other people maybe found, you know, their Egyptian or Celtic, whatever temple was all cleared up, and it worked for me. I've been calling my elemental spirit helpers as part of my sutra level practice, where you know, do a purification with air and fire and all that. And I've been calling on them for that during my normal practice. Well, when we did this guided meditation, they went right for it. And it took me to a state that was just amazing. And since then, sometimes I can just visualize my way into that state. And later on in the, this isn't a secret, it gets damn close. There's some things I can't talk about at Vajrayana level, but basically there's procedures for calling where the death experience is one where you lose the earth and things would be sort of watery, flowing, then you'd lose the water portion and you'd be picking up on smoke-like visions, and then you'd lose the air portion and you'd pick up on the fire portion, and you'd end up with like seeing sparks, and then you'd go into a darkness, like a light, and then darkness, and then you go into the bardo. This is like, you know,
what's the bardo?
Right? It's a state in between birth.
Oh, okay.
They describe the death experience, and it's preliminary to visualization. It's used as a practice too, but also so when people do die, they're able to make the transition without being completely freaked.
Right.
There's more to it than that.
Then they sort of anticipate.
Yeah. But, you know, it turned out that I read that Tibetan Buddhism, and it's exactly what I went through in that workshop. It wasn't
like you went through a death experience?
Well, you know, I went through exactly the work with the elements. Put yourself in a state of emptiness.
All right.
And I wasn't expecting anything like those results.
All right.
But, you know, later on I've been exposed to rituals where, you know, that's, you know, and you know, tomes of, you know, procedures for doing stuff. Well, that's what you do before you would invoke a yidam or a entity whose characteristics you'd like to pick up on. You know, but that was Tibetan Buddhism, but I picked up on that, you know, in a pagan gathering. And,
all interrelated.
Yeah, it's all interrelated. I mean, yeah, there's, you know, but the kind of resonances you can get are interesting. Like working with nature spirits is another topic. If you nature has a group mind.
Everything in the clouds. There's a big storm coming in. Literally, we have a circle of open air above us, a storm going on.
Yeah, it's not at all unusual. If you basically what you do is go out in nature. You want to find a power spot where nature is receptive to what you're planning on doing. So what you do is you center yourself. Connect mentally with the sunlight and the air, earth, air, fire, water, as it were. Get us channel energy like you do the tree meditation. You know, channel it as a love energy and transmit the energy throughout the region, and then contact the spirits of the land and ask those that, you know, say why you're there. If you got a given purpose, you're going to do a ritual for earth healing, even money magic, whatever. And you see where you're getting a good response. And you go to that location. And if you do it like a day in advance sometimes, and you
sort of test the
see
water.
what you have in mind, and you mentally go over what you're planning on doing. If you got a group, you can, you know, visualize the group and ask them to connect with this. You know, you'll get feedback essentially. You may get a feeling, they'll send you to a certain area or a vision. Depends on how your psychic signals go, but if the vibe is good, you start getting, and you go into an area that's responsive, and you can ask yes or no answers, and you can tell how the response is. And if go over the details of what you have in mind, you may get some changes brought back to you, ask if you're in the right spot, everything's cool. Then you basically, what you do is you visualize that you're going to be coming back and invite the spirits to join you and bring their friends.
So you're sending out invitations.
Right, you send out an invitation. When you go back to that area, it may be rainy and 34 degrees, and it's not at all unusual when you get to the spot where you do the working, and there's a hole in the clouds overhead. And there's like, you may find foxfire if you're going towards suns, you know, in a circle or something. It's not at all unusual to have the birds and plants, birds and insects and frogs basically responding to your invitations. You can have leaves falling down at certain points and amazing energy going on.
Sheds of sunlight, cats running around the circle.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff happens. And, you know.
Are you okay?
Yeah.
You getting bored? All right. Okay.
It depends, you know, what you have to treat the consciousness of nature, you know, with respect. There's not all had good experiences with people. We had remember that big maple tree with a nasty vibe for quite a while? Yeah, basically
our grandfather tree. Yeah.
Right, and it really was upset because of there's the moved into a place where there was some property, where they had some trees in the backyard, and there's a couple of big maples. One of the vibe was fine, the other one was like standoffish. So we respected space, and we were doing medicine wheel rituals and stuff like that, and it picked up on what we were about. And the vibe switched over to essentially like a guardian on the north. And then we did we found out that it was very upset because all of most of his friends had been killed, you know, building all the buildings and everything in the area.
Right.
So we went in conjunction with Church of All Worlds group that we were part of, and Cedar Lake Groves, a Druid group, we did a tree planting.